first and second group of amendments, but I am against Mr. James To's third group of amendments, so I speak. Mr. Felix Chong. Madam Deputy, when the stamp duty measure was launched on the first day, I already said that they are not going to be effective. A lot of people don't believe in me, but now they have changed their stance. But then still, they don't dare to veto it down, veto a policy which distorts the market seriously. A month ago, the CE was interviewed, and she admitted it. She said that these harsh measures failed. They don't achieve the desired effects. And she also acknowledged that this affects the supply of flats in the secondary markets. Internally, the government knows very well that this is a distorted policy distorting the market, but nobody dared to spit it out and ask for cancelling the harsh measures. Because they said that they will not know what will happen if the harsh measures are withdrawn. Maybe the property prices will skyrocket uncontrollably, and people, in anticipation of the withdrawal of the measures, will try to get involved in panic buying. And I know about the free market principle in supply and demand. As long as there is a good supply, then the prices will go down. But then there is an imbalance between supply and demand now. We know the figures. Several years ago, 90% of the transactions are in the secondary market, 10% in first-hand. Now it's 65% versus 35%. That has been a reverse in the trend because there isn't enough supply in the secondary market. So if you relax the restriction on the secondary market, then we will be seeing 90% of the transactions in the secondary market, and the prices will come down naturally. It might go up a bit, but then ultimately it will come down. Madam Deputy, now we are talking about $10,000 to $20,000 per square foot now. That's beyond the affordability of the members of the public. If it increases to, say, $20,000 to $30,000 per square foot, then it's also unaffordable. So if we have enough supply, then the property prices will naturally come down. As what the Undersecretary said, our policy is to try to prevent supply-demand imbalance. But we are seeing the imbalance as a result of your policy. And some members said that we should extend the 6 months to 9 months and 12 months in terms of the statutory time limit for disposing the original property, so that people dare to replace their properties because they are given sufficient time to sell off their property. So this, again, is releasing supply. So ultimately, what we are talking about is we should try to increase the supply in the secondary market. And why we have a tight supply is all because of government policies. Now, property prices are related not only to harsh measures, but the government policies are the main culprit for jacking up property prices. Let me give an example. The land price, every time when land is sold, the prices are going higher and higher. And it's all the government's policy. Now, in Wong Chuk Hang, the topside development above the Wong Chuk Hang MTR station, it used to be a public housing estate, and then an MTR station was built, and after that, the land was sold, and then the property developers submitted a bid. We're talking about $10 billion. Now we're talking about $10,000 per square foot, and when it is sold as a unit, at least it will cost $30,000 per square foot. So even without the construction works commencing, the property prices in Wong Chuk Hang have already soared. So it's all because of the government's making. Now, if it used to be a public housing estate, well, just to keep it as a public housing estate or HOS in the future, and we will not be seeing the $20,000 or $30,000 per square foot situation. Is all the government's making. And also Mr. Holden Chow referred to mortgage rate. Now, the banks are allowed only to cap it at 50%, and now the developers are offering, say, 80% to 90% in loan-to-value ratio. So everybody now joins, buys first-hand property. So that's why we're seeing this 35%, and also the prices have reached record high in terms of the transaction volume. Last year, we're talking about an amount of some $200 billion. So really, I admire Mr. Abraham Shak. He's from the property sector, but he's against this amendment bill. The HKMA is controlling the loans from banks, so the average citizen can't afford the second-hand properties, so they go to buy first-hand properties. And there is another approach in the past. There was a bridging loan to be offered by banks. So you sell off your flat first, and then you know exactly when will you receive the payment, and then you'll buy your new property. And then the banks will give you a bridging loan for you to buy a new property first. Well, they don't even have to really resort to using this 6-month statutory time limit. You have to buy first, and then sell off your property later. That's a limitation, and the government's policy is the main reason jacking up property prices. The HKMA is controlling the bank's loan-to-value ratio, but they're not monitoring or regulating the finance companies. So many finance companies are taking out advertisings in TV, giving loans to people buying properties, and the HKMA is turning a blind eye to these. For those people, if they want to take out a loan from the banks, they can't get the loans. Another figure here. The property index has risen consecutively for 20 months. If you study economics, you understand why. Why is that the case? 20 months ago, the demand at that time, is there a big difference between that demand and the demand now? And Mr. Michael Wong, the Development Secretary, said that they have exceeded the target. And the original target was 18,000, and now it's 24,000 in terms of the supply of private residential properties. If that is the case, why is that still an escalation in the property prices? It goes to show all your housing policies are wrong.
20 months ago, the government was pushing out land for public and private housing. After so many flats have been completed, property prices have risen for 20 months in a row. This is because of the land premium issues and so forth. And I disagree with what Mr. Kenneth Leung said about indefinite demand. Demand is very much psychologically driven. If you expect prices to rise, of course, you wouldn't mind. During the SARS outbreak, the luxury flat cost only $3,000 a square foot, and no one wanted to buy it. Now with $3,000, you can only buy a toilet cubicle. So it all depends on your psychology and what you expect, and this determines demand. And if the bill is passed today, then money kept by law firms will be transferred to our public coffers. No wonder Mr. Porchen, the FS, said that we're going to have a very handsome amount of surplus. It would easily be over $150 billion because we have tens of billions of dollars kept by law firms. So I'm quite sure you can easily make more than $150,000 in surplus. So with so much money, I think you can do two things. First, you scrap the offsetting arrangement under MPFA and don't ask the business sector to give you a penny. And then you can also set up a retirement fund for the grassroots so that we can all have a share in the wealth accumulated by the government. That's acceptable. We won't object to that. Regarding the amendments by Mr. James and Mr. Holden Chow, they're very similar. It's either 9 months or 12 months or 12 months or 9 months. Still, we find Mr. James To's amendment problematic and will oppose it because he requires application to the government. Why should it be so troublesome? So within 9 or 12 months, if you can dispose of your regional property, you ask the administration to give you a refund. Why do you have to apply for the government's approval first? This is a very troublesome, and this will add to the administrative cost. So Mr. Holden Chow's amendment is ideal. There can be an automatic refund of stamp duty to the home purchaser. Although we oppose the bill, we will oppose Mr. James To's amendment because it's not realistic. We're going to support Mr. Holden Chow's amendment because if we oppose both and if we don't have enough we don't have enough votes for Mr. Holden Chow's amendment, then we are doing a disservice to home purchasers. Thank you. Dr. Kwokake, thank you. I think we're traveling back in time when it comes to the debate on this stamp duty amendment bill. It was introduced in end 2016. The administration claimed that it could dampen the exuberant property market, making it easier for people to buy homes. Now, more than a year after its introduction, property prices have seen new hikes, and it's impossible for young people to own their homes. So a young graduate will take 19 years without eating or any expenses, and all his income will have to go will go into his first flat, and that's the calculation by Centerline earlier this year. Perhaps now is another 10% more. And you are going to tell young people out there the world is beautiful and there is no division in society and everyone can live happily. This is entirely rubbish. By means of these harsh measures, the administration wanted to control demand. It may be useful at ordinary times, but then Hong Kong is no longer like what it used to be. Just 2 weeks ago, a site of the former North Point Estate site is now selling, and is selling at $68,000 per square foot. And the two adjoining units would cost over $100 billion. And they can pay by cash together with the stamp duty. They don't need to do any mortgage. People carry cash in suitcases to Hong Kong to buy flats. And what is meant by non-luxury flats? You can walk all the way from Tin Shui Wai to Aberdeen. You cannot find any non-luxury flat. In the past, according to the government, a luxury flat would typically be selling over $6 or $7 million. But now you go and check. There is a new residential development in Tsuen Wan, a 40,000 square foot flat costs $7 million. And you call that a luxury flat in Tsuen Wan? This is all the government's making because of his ever-changing land policy. You may say that that's the making of greedy Zhang. But don't forget that in greedy Zhang's administration, Carrie Lam was the Secretary for Development. He was responsible for identifying land. If she was so good, she should have advised her boss to find land for public and private housing. No, he was not a Secretary for Development. He was just a permanent secretary. Then he became the Secretary for Development and later the CS for A. Carrie Lam should not pretend to be ignorant. She has been involved in land matters more than any other official in the government, and now she's talking about lack of supply. And a secretary, oh, I beg your pardon, you're the secretary now. Just 2 days ago, at a housing panel meeting, we debated with you. 5 years ago, it was said that 75,000 units could be delivered, and ultimately, it's just $60,000. So, a difference of 20,000 or 20% or 19,000 flats in 10 years. The big tycoons, property developers behind Mr. Abraham Sheikh can decide when they sell their flats. There is nothing you can do about that. And these harsh measures are just pushing business over to them. Under the current circumstances, who can afford the flat? Acting Secretary, I'm sure you know. Why are first-hand flats so popular? Because property developers can give you a secondary mortgage. If the cap is 60% by Hong Kong MA, they can give you a 90% or even 95% mortgage. Together with FIs, you can discuss with the real estate agents outside these new developments. They can. If you say you don't have enough money, they can help you to borrow money. So people queue up to buy first-hand flats, and property developers, of course, have to raise the flat prices. Otherwise, they will not be doing justice to their shareholders. My question for Mr. Michael Wong is, well, 2,100 flats equivalent of land was sold in the last quarter, and according to the administration, that's enough. In fact, in 2 quarters together, we are short of over 20,000 flats. And you just sold land enough to build 2,100 flats, and you said that was enough. This government is so short-sighted. Research studies by Centerline, of course, their findings will be different from that of government. You ask Frank Chan, 2% of the buys in Hong Kong were from the mainland. This is an idiot. Only idiots would believe it. You talk to the frontline real estate agents and you look at Centerline reports. Over 30% of the buyers of luxury flats and also 14.5% of the mass market flats are from the mainland. And there are also new arrivals, people who hold Hong Kong ID cards, like us. Among the high-end first-hand sale flats, I believe half of the buyers are from the mainland, or the capital would come from the mainland. Of course, there are also ghost buyers who are acquiring flats through Hong Kong PRs in order to save the BSD. So the government is is pretending to be ignorant. Last July, same as Siwa Leung, Carrie Lam claimed that housing was among the top priorities in her government. As in the past, the government is just paying lip service. And she asked Hong Kong people not to buy flats because there will be interest rate hikes and future supply will also increase. This is silly. Can we have more supply? 3 or 20,000 flats per year. Every year we have over 50,000 new households, people who get married every year. Many of them are not eligible for public housing, and we also have new households from the mainland. I think 20–50% is on the conservative side, because we have a very sluggish secondary market, and many people cannot afford first-hand properties. The stamp duty amendment bill is like using poison to treat cough, but it's not going to be effective because this is poison. Is the government short of land? There is no one from the Development Bureau, and it's hard for me to discuss this with the professor. We have over 1,000 hectares of village house development, 1,300 hectares of brownfield sites. It's not the first time we have mentioned this. We have been asking the government to face up to these issues in the past decade. But the government has turned a deaf ear to all these. We asked former Secretary of Development, we discussed with them brownfield sites, and he said that what is meant by brownfield sites, we don't have a definition. That's Paul Chen. When he was the Secretary for Development, he didn't have a definition for a brownfield site. He had no statistics, and now we know that there are 1,300 hectares, about 500 hectares of them in newly developed areas. So do we have to wait for you to conduct studies of these places? In fact, for brownfield sites, unauthorized development before 1972, they are waived. And then what about after 1972? Unauthorized development, turning these sites into open storage after 1972, and a change of its use and damage of the site, and they have no qualms at all because of the government's connivance. And whether we're talking about subdivided units or factory turned residential flats or street sleeping, people have no choice but to accept such arrangements, because the threshold for applying a PRH is very low. You have to wait for at least 4.7 years. The first offer will be 4.7 years. The earliest flats are facing a refuse, a room, or a flat with a very hideous background. And so while they're waiting for a PRH unit, they have no choice but to sleep in subdivided units.
We criticize young people for lining up for public housing unit without any ambition. What about those who exceed the income and asset limit? Just 8,000 units for several 100,000 people. We're talking about 2, 3, 4,000. So where should they stay? In the street? Will they become street sleepers? Sleep in subdivided units? So we're not against the harsh measures proposed by the government. Because this is such an incompetent government anyway. It is still necessary to ask the government to do something. Even though we know definitely the measures won't work. Can we still say that we should be grateful because the stamp duty can help curb speculations? Dr. Ting-kwong, please restrict your speech to the CSAs proposed by members. I'm coming to that, Madam Deputy, because James Toll's amendments target the plight, the predicament facing Hong Kong people. Thereby, he suggests stretching the time limit to 6 to 9 months. But can we solve the problem? Of course not. Still, we need to carry on because this would help people, especially those who are waiting for a flat. I know some friends in their 30s or 40s who have just had a new member of the family, and they would like to move on from 300-400 square feet to 500-600 square feet. Their request is really meager. It's not a luxury home, but now even the 500 square foot home is called a luxury home because the per square foot price is $20,000. And we also have people staying with their family, staying in the streets, staying in subdivided units, in factory subdivided units. Even those who get married need to stay in their separate homes after their honeymoon trip because it is impossible to wait for rent to come down. And what about public rental housing? Well, if they exceed the threshold, you need to resort to the various schemes, starter homes, etc. Well, we have 50,000 new marriages every year, and you only have 10,000 new flats on stream. And would you ask people to be grateful for the government's help? I really cannot agree with the proposal. You're only helping those who would like to have the properties replaced, but you're not helping the situation in general. If the government continues to deceive itself and to address Hong Kong people's issues in such a way, then we're not doing justice to young people and young families who would like to have their properties replaced, because they will continue to be mortgage slaves and be soulless. Does any other member wish to speak? Mr. James Toll. Madam Chair, when I spoke for the first round, I stated my grounds of extending the statutory time limit. And the government gave a preliminary response after I spoke. And then they will also respond towards the end of the debate. Why is it that they oppose lengthening the period from 6 to 9 and 10 months and 12 months during the second reading of the debate? According to the government, they were afraid of sending a wrong message that the harsh measure would be made less harsh. Now, I don't know how they explain this away, that wrong message will no longer be sent. But anyway, that's what the government suggests now. And then the period can be lengthened on members' request. However, the government has not answered our question. In the past, if the government's position is that if somebody buys a property and holds that property for a protracted period of time before selling the original property, the government would think, because the owner has two properties at the time, there will be an incentive to engage in speculation. And according to the government's rationale, if the owner buys a second property, holds the second property before disposing of the original property, then this is a de facto speculation, since they do not need to pay the 15% new AVD. It's not a question of whether a message will be sent. It's a question of whether this actually will happen. I didn't understand the government's argument then. And just now when I heard the Secretary's response, I didn't hear any figures, any analysis, any reason why they do not think this will happen. I am not asking the government to admit the wrong and apologize. But if this was the argument they held in the past, now we are puzzled as we do not know the reason of their change of position. And they need to be accountable and they need to explain to us. If at the Bills Committee that was the argument they held, now they don't explain to us whether this argument still exists and why they have changed. The government says it's all right not to explain as long as we don't send a message that we are doing away with the harshness of the measure. Still, it is not about perception. If after either my amendment or Mr. Holden-Chow's amendments are passed, such that the time limit will be increased from 6 to 9 or 12 months, and that those property owners can abuse the gap to engage in speculation. Of course, I don't agree with this argument, but the government should at least analyze the situation for us. Don't just tell us whether you support it or not. Second point, by introducing the various stamp duty harsh measures, the consequence is that property developers will enjoy an edge over transactions involving replacement of properties or other transactions. If you want to pull the secondary market closer to the first-hand market, we can only do so by introducing this measure to help replacing properties in the secondary market. It's a question of fairness. Let's say if the time limit is very short, 1 or 6 months, then you'll be forcing homeowners to sell the flat and then buy one from the first-hand market because they have a longer period. That means if they have a 36 months period or 3 years to replace the original property. So say if I own a flat in the secondary market, if I sell the flat, I will be increasing supply in the market. And actually, at different hearings, according to the practitioners or estate agents in the market, the secondary market basically is frozen because homeowners dare not sell their flats in the secondary market. It's not about expectation that prices would go up. It's about whether there would be buyers who would buy a flat in the secondary market. So if you would like to buy either your first or second property in the market, if you want to replace your property, you need to revitalize the secondary market. And it has a knock-on effect. For example, if you want to change your flat from a 1,000 square feet one to a 1,500 square feet one, then those living in, say, 600 square foot home may wish to change to a 800 square foot one, so on and so forth. And a chain of transactions would, in the end, lead to increase in supply. So regardless of the supply figures cited by the government, like Dr. K.K. Kwok just now said, you have 50,000 new marriages registered in Hong Kong every year. Basically, it is not enough, and you need to revitalize the secondary market. Extending the period for refund of stamp duty is one feasible solution. And I'd like to speak out, in all fairness, for the estate agents. At at the Bills Committee, that is Stamp Duty Amendment number 2 bill, there was a public hearing, and I heard some of the arguments. I think that the government could consider their arguments here as well. Let's say if an owner has 2 properties, and if he sells off one and buys another one, meaning he has replaced one of his 2 properties, under the existing bill, no refund is available. Well, let me explain again. Let's say if I have 2 flats, which I don't. Let's say if I have one of the flats, 1,000 square feet. If I sell it for 400 square feet flat, that means when I buy the second one, I need to pay for the second stamp duty for the second 1,000 square feet flat, and then for the 400 square feet home, I cannot have any refund of stamp duty. Well, it has to do with 6-month, 9-month time limit, Madam Chair, and I need to explain this to the government. Imagine this scenario that I just cited. You may need to impose some conditions. Let's say if I have the second home, you may need to impose another condition. If you sell a large flat in replacement of a smaller flat, you may be eligible for stamp duty refund. Say if I sell a 100 square feet home for a 400 square feet home, in return, I am releasing 600 square feet into the market. But it's not as simple as that. Despite the size of the flat, your extended family, some other household members can also live in that. But on the whole, you are increasing the market supply by 600 square feet. In a way, you're helping the government increase land and housing supply. Unfortunately, in the current bill setting, you're not eligible for stamp duty refund. You may ask why I should help speculators. That's not true. I'm taking a social perspective. Those prospective homeowners who would like to buy a flat, who hasn't one in hand, if you could help increase overall supply in the market, it would help stabilize the market, or it may help trigger a replacement of property more easily, and this would help revitalize the second-hand market. But I think the government is really stubborn. I still need to make my point, because not many people would listen to the Bills Committee's meetings, and some might think that it is biased from the property sector's point of view. They could easily want to have a vibrant secondary market. I have no interest involved. I'm thinking for the society.
Some estate agents also jokingly said, but they come with good grounds, I would say, if somebody now is not replacing a property, he is willing to sell his property to increase the property supply. You should give him some incentives. And people following the debate live would say that, well, that's ridiculous. Maybe the person will be having a big profit from selling his property. Why are you still offering an incentive to him? What I focus on is ultimately when he sells the flat, then it's like a charitable act in the present environment, because somebody will be able to buy his flat. So that's good for the society as a whole. So should we be using tax incentives or other means? The government must consider this. Your perspective may be that now, as long as the prices are good, the owner will sell off his flat. And if it is a small flat, then that would not be of good use. But instead of looking into difficulties, focusing on difficulties in identifying land, if this owner sells a flat, then this flat can be taken up by somebody else, say 1 month later. And if, say, 5,000 people sell their flats, then, well, 5,000 flats will be available in a month's time. So no matter how hard the URA works and how they would try to ask the police to help out in chasing away the tenants and so on, all you can supply is just 100 to 200 units. So I think the government must consider this. Second, Madam Deputy, replacing the properties. It doesn't suffice. We're just lengthening the statutory time limit. At the Bills Committee, your colleague, Madam Deputy, Mr. Ting-kwong, also mentioned this. And he should be the first one who raised this. But then Mr. Poche and Mr. Abraham Shah also expanded on his point. And what he was mentioning was about the cash flow issue. Imagine you have 800 square feet, you want to buy a 1,000 square feet flat. You have to pay for the 15% of the stamp duty for the 1,000 square foot unit. So that means a sum of $1.5 million. So you have to make available $1.5 million upfront, and you will only get some refund afterwards. So that presents a cash flow problem for some people, especially for the owners who are going to buy a larger flat. The amount is even larger. We have discussed this many times, and we asked whether the government can provide a bank guarantee. Allow for bank guarantee to be provided. In fact, I have moved CSA, but the Mr. Andrew Leung did not approve the CSA. And then some colleagues asked me, why didn't I move the CSA on the bank guarantee? I did submit the CSAs, but these were not approved by Mr. Andrew Leung. And I think the government should not be taking a passive role. Well, just say that we will approve the CSA on the 9 months or 12 months. Well, would you consider my CSA on bank guarantee? You should not be passive in all of these. You should take the initiative to do more things. You should take on new mindset or new thinking. Does any other member wish to speak? Mr. Raymond Chan, call for quorum. Mr. Raymond Chan calls for quorum.
現在會議已經有
We have formed a quorum. Let's continue with the meeting. Mr. Raymond Chan. Thank you, Madam Deputy. I will continue to speak in support of the amendments moved by Mr. James Tow and Mr. Holden Chow, and that is to extend the statutory time limit for replacing the properties of owners. Now, property developers are very powerful, and the first-hand property market is under their control, under this visible hand, and the market is totally distorted, and small owners find it difficult to sell their flats. The government has condoned property developers to provide a high mortgage ratio, and the secondary market has died, and the property owners find it difficult to sell their second-hand properties. And the government's policies will actually stifle the secondary market altogether. Those who would like to sell their flats find it difficult to sell their flats within 6 months. Carrie Lam said that a large number of starter homes will be built. And normally, banks will be providing a higher loan-to-value ratio to such homes, and that would also dilute the demand for secondary market. And as a result, owners will find it increasingly difficult to find buyers. And in the next few years, there will be more such new homes to be made available in the market, in the first-hand property market as well. And in order to improve the quality of living, owners will spend longer time to identify the right buyers for their existing properties.
Therefore, this is the opportune time to introduce the amendments by the two honourable members here, and that is to allow property purchasers to apply for extension of the time to 9 to 12 months, so that he will have more time to sell his old property and to apply for refund of the stamp duty. I think Mr. James Tow and Mr. Holden Chow's amendment logically will not be able to achieve this accused effect of the government, that is, will send a wrong message to the market that the government is going to remove its harsh measures. Now, Mr. James Tow, I am of the view that Mr. James Tow's amendment will not create that effect on the following 5 grounds. First, that is to extend the period from 9 or 12 months. That is not going to encourage people who have limited means to buy another flat. And secondly, it is just the same. And third, the user will not hold on to his old flat for another 9 or 12 months and benefit. Secondly, and I think it is there is more harm than good if you hold on to a flat that you cannot rent out. First, to extend that period to 9 to 12 months, that will not encourage speculation. Now, this extra 50% VAT, and the period will be extended to 9 to 12 months. It will not encourage people with limited means that can only afford only one flat. This extra stamp duty would like to increase the speculation cost of speculators. Speculators are people who have owned or hoarded more than one unit, and the government claims that Mr. James Tow's amendment would send out the message the government is going to remove the harsh measures, and that is will curb speculation. This exemption period is to cater for those who would like to trade up their flats, and if the flat can be sold within 6 months, then he is still deemed to own one property only, although there was a short period of overlapping, and therefore that 15% stamp duty will be refunded. But for this, people who trade up their flats, they are usually people with limited means. How can they afford to buy another 2 to 3 flats and then become speculators? If they can't sell their old flat within 6 months of acquiring a new flat, If they can do so within 9 to 12 months after purchase of a new flat, how come this extra 3 to 6 months will turn a user to a speculator? Well, speculator, he wants to own only one flat, but that period of overlapping makes him a two-flat owner for a very short period of time. And Mr. James To's proposal is to extend the exemption period for 3 to 6 months, and that is if the flat can be sold within 9 to 12 months, a refund of the NRCSD can be refunded. Government originally objected to this because it would give people the impression that is going to remove the harsh measures. Now, for someone who owns an old flat, who wants to trade up his unit, now if at the 7th or 8th or 9th month he sells his old unit, then he owns only one unit, his new flat, and he is a single unit owner, and the flat is for self-occupation instead of investment. The vacated flat will not be rented out. Otherwise, he will be homeless. So for people who like to improve their living conditions, if the old flat is sold within 9 to 12 months, he still owns one flat. And his situation is just like the same, like his counterpart who sells his old unit within 6 months. So this is not against the policy intent and will not curb speculation. And even though he owes another unit for another couple of months, that would not cause him to benefit. I think one of the reasons for the government's objection is if at the 9th to 12, during the period 9 to 12 months, when the old flat is sold, and if an NRSD can be refunded, then this will give a message to flat owners that the government encourages people to hold on to their old flats for a little bit longer. Perhaps the market will suddenly soar after 9 months, and then property owners can fetch more. I think this is under the assumption that the longer you hold on to your flat, the more expensive flats will be, and then you can benefit more. Then this will show that the harsh measures are ineffective. In fact, the market will not just go up and not down. And if the buyer intends to store and hold on to his old flat, he has to bear the risk of a downturn in the market. And for people who would like to sell his old flat for cash, and if he's holding on to his flat to wait for a better price and wait until the 9th or the 12th months, then he will have to turn down many offers. He may even have to remove his market from the list. And he may have to, at the end of the 12th month, he may have to offer a big discount in order to get rid of his old property. There are many property owners who would like to trade up their flats for better living conditions. How many of them will be willing to put themselves in such a risky position with little chance of benefiting? And then one of the assumptions of the government is that if we extend it to 9 to 12 months, then it will encourage people who hold on to their old unit to gain immensely. Now, my theory is exactly opposite. If the flat owner holds on to his flat until the 9th or 12th months, there is more harm than good, because it's not easy for him to find someone who is only willing to rent his flat for just less than 1 year. So if you assume that he can gain from the rent within the 9 to 12-month period is not possible. So in the interim, he has to bear the extra cost, for instance, and then 9 to 12 months of management fees, and that can range from a few thousand to a few tens of thousands of dollars. And he has to pay another 2 to 3 quarters of rates. So for people who want to trade up their flats for better living conditions with limited means, this is rather unlikely to happen. So if you think that a property owner would deliberately store and hold on to his old unit for a little bit longer for the sake of speculation, this is very unlikely. If the flat cannot be sold at the 7th month, it is probably due to conditions beyond his control. And that is because of this distorted market, which is so unfavorable to secondary flats. So I think Mr. James To's proposal is quite good. Of course, we cannot amend it anymore. You should not. Now, under Mr. Holden Chow's model, there is no need to apply for approval. And Mr. James To's proposal is to apply for government approval first. I think it is best if a bank guarantee can be granted without really levying the stamp duty. If the flat is not sold after 12 months, then the IRD can then claim that extra part of stamp duty. I understand that this proposal by Mr. James To is rejected by the government. I support the extension because this will reduce the unfairness of the bill. Because setting at 6 months is unfair to owners who have to trade up their properties for some specific reasons. Now, assuming that we have two flat owners who have both bought a new one and they have to sell their old flat of 400 square feet, how soon they can sell their flat depends a lot on the location, the age, and also the economic situation, and also the service quality of the real estate agents concerned. So if both want to sell their 400 square foot flat, owner A has his flat in the urban area close to an MTR station. Flat owner B has a small house which is rather remote from the urban area. So it's more likely for flat A for owner A to sell his flat sooner if the period is 6 months, and beyond that, no refund of the NRSD can be granted, and if no extension can be sought, then owner A has a higher chance of selling his old flat and getting a refund. So if we disregard conditions like location of the flat, then it's not fair to flat B. The age of the flat, and assuming both owners are looking for a new flat and they like to sell their 400 square foot flat, if one is lift lending, the other is not, one is a relative new flat and the other is older than 40 years old, well, the two face very different conditions. Of course, we have to draw a line. We can't be so flexible. We cannot give special treatment to flats that are in remote areas without any lift service, so on and so forth. But these people are not speculating. They have constraints when it comes to the conditions of their flats. If we can relax the period to 1 year in this bill, this is more reasonable. For people with limited means, usually it takes longer for them to sell their old flat than those with that are better off. Because usually if you have limited means, you are usually not so competitive. The flat may not be at a prime location. It may be rather old, and real estate agents may not work so hard to help you. But for owners that are better off, relatively speaking, their flats are usually more favorable at a better location, and real estate agents are usually more proactive in helping them to find buyers. Another reason for me to support the amendment is because the information and justifications from the administration are not very sufficient and also not realistic. I will say more later. Ms. Claudia Mo. I'd like to follow up on my point, and that is the biggest problem with our property market is, of course, land supply. However, just outside the chamber, someone put this question to me. You support Mr. James To's amendment to extend the period for selling the old property from 6 months to 9 months. And if you cannot sell your old flat within 6 months, then you cannot get a refund. And Mr. James To's amendment seeks to extend it from 6 months to 12 months. That is a year. And you are blatantly favoring the small flat owners. And there may be flats at prime locations, old flats at Kowloon West, in Yau Chin Mong, for instance. If these flats can wait for a year before the time is due for collection of NRSD, then I can use or rent the flat out as a service apartment for a year. I can rent it to individual visitors and on a daily rates and so on and so forth.
And I can agree with the buyer that despite the sale and purchase agreement, we can complete the transaction later. Just allow me 10 more months. Now, from this example, we would definitely think whether we should really allow such small owners to benefit. Would people make use of loopholes to reap benefits? But I do have reason to believe that it's not as prevalent, because if we have rule of law, the spirit of the law is that we should not wrong the innocent. In order to punish a handful, we should not require the majority property owners to face the same predicament when they have their properties replaced. We should not use the blanket approach, draw a line, and say that this is applicable to all. And by citing these arguments, you could suggest that the statutory time limit for disposal of your original property should be limited to 6 months. And that's the argument the government cited in the past, saying that the owners could make a profit as a result of the time limit. But if you really want to help Hong Kong people, you should not do like Mr. Abraham Shek said, that the government is making people suffer. You should not sacrifice the majority just to punish a handful. This is undesirable. Now, I'd like to talk about the issue of land. It is related to the property market. And, Chairman, I'd like to remind the government about the Fanling Golf Course. It is said to be equivalent to 9 Victorian parks, or the whole area of Tsuen Wan City Centre. I know it is difficult just to scrap it, but at least the government could allot 10 or 20% of the land for public housing development. If the site is used to the full, it could accommodate 350,000 people. Well,
we always say that we cannot catch up with the public housing production target, and it has a knock-on effect affecting the public rental housing applications, the private housing market, rental market, subdivided units, etc. I understand that stating the grounds of public interest, it will only take a year's time to resume land in Fanling golf course. But how about we take it in phases? We just acquire 10 or 20% first. I understand that the government is working on it. Ms. Claudia Mo, I hope that you would go back to the motion. We are now in Committee of the Whole Council. Please do not digress. Come back to this debate. I know, because you have spoken for a number of times already. Please come back to the debate. All right? The other situation I'm aware of is this, and I agree with this. Mr. James To has moved an amendment, but I mean, he floated an idea, but it has to do with public expenditure, and therefore the amendment was not accepted. Now you have the harsh measure, new AVD, so that if you're already an existing homeowner, if you buy a second property, you'll be required to pay double the stamp duty. Well, usually people go from a smaller flat to a larger flat, not the other way around, but people now are deterred. Mr. James To said that the flat rate of 15% new AVD is a huge burden on small owners. So can we just put the 15% on hold, and that it could be paid by guarantee by a bank when one purchases a new property? Ms. Claudia Mo, this is not the topic of this debate. You should make this point at the stage of second reading. You should focus on the amendments now. Right, but Mr. Ray Chen just now raised the same point. Why can't I make the same point again? But I am chairing the meeting now. Please respect my decision. Bank guarantee. Yes, Mr. James To. Chairman, well, it's a point of order. The reason is that Ms. Claudia Mo talked about my proposed CSA, which was rejected by you on the grounds of its relevance with public expenditure. That's about the amendment of extending the limit from 6 to 9 months. That's not the understanding I have on Ms. Claudia Mo's remarks. But as you understand, I have been quite tolerant and I have been quite relaxed over the past 2 days because of what happened before. And I understand that the Madam Deputy also took the same approach. But when a member is beginning to repeat herself, I feel responsible to remind the member to come back to this debate. Please let me finish, Chairman. Well, I'm not sure about Ms. Claudia Mo, but that's my understanding. Perhaps you can clarify with her, Chairman. If she is talking about the amendment of changing 6 months to 9 months to help the public, well, if she comes back to this debate, I will allow her to continue. You don't need to remind Ms. Claudia Mo by way of a point of order. I think that Ms. Claudia Mo is aware of what's happening. Of course, I am referring to their amendments of changing the statutory time limit from 6 to 9 and 12 months. I'm not going to repeat the predicament of homeowners selling a flat in the secondary market. It depends on the location, age of building, and the estate agent's quality. Or rather, if you decide not to use an estate agent, you could approach any prospective owners directly. There are still a lot of difficulties. Even if you relax the time limit, if I go for a bigger flat, because it's punitive in nature, the harsh measure affects me. Well, assuming I'm just a small owner, I'm not a speculator, all I want is to purchase a bigger flat and dispose of my smaller flat. But as I buy a bigger flat, I would need to consider a number of things. I need to pay stamp duty first before I ask for a refund, either through some processes or through an automatic mechanism. If you want to deter speculators by the harsh measure, you are deterring me as well. The property prices are already soaring, and I am required to pay the stamp duty upfront, and you have already said no to a bank guarantee for the stamp duty payment. So if you urge them not to collect payment and instead agree to take the bank's guarantee, but of course the banks may not agree to provide a guarantee, at least the government will be taking a step back by heeding our views, although there is a hurdle to go through as far as the banks are concerned. I hope that you would think it through. I don't know whether you would come back again for the third time or for the fourth time, for the fourth harsh measure, an even harsher measure, and then you would just fool us around in the chamber. Despite a lengthy debate, the government would stand firm on its grounds, and then for some reason, maybe political reasons, the government can also all of a sudden change its stance. Does any other member wish to speak? Mr. James Toh. Chairman, this is a joint debate, and perhaps I should move on to the third part. I didn't talk about the third group just now. Well, in the course of scrutinizing the bill, I found something very strange, and that the agents would also be involved. Let's say in a property transaction, there'll be an instrument or a sale and purchase agreement, and we know that there is a flat rate of new AVD, which is very harsh. For a $10 million flat, that means $1.5 million. Under the IRO, under what circumstances can we pursue the $1.5 million? It provides that any signatories to the contract, as well as the seller and the purchaser. Now, under normal circumstances, this would be referred to as the seller and the purchaser, but an estate agent would be involved. And if the and it turns out that the estate agent will also be liable for payment of the stamp duty. And I know people who do not trust estate agents at all, and they envied the estate agencies for having ground floor shops and engaging in speculative activities. They might make co-investments in order to make a profit, and the estate agents usually charge 1% or 0.5% as commission. But things can get complicated. For first-hand flats, I heard that estate agents sometimes charge a 4% commission. Usually, it stands at 1 or 0.5%. As it turns out, under the law, estate agents may be liable for paying 15% stamp duty. Well, only under extreme circumstances would the estate agents be involved.
Usually, the IRD should go after the seller, the purchaser, and there is no reason to pursue the amount with the estate agent. From a moral point of view, the government or the IRD will not start dunning the debt from the estate agent. But still, this is an archaic law. Tax or levy collection is a well-established practice, be it Hong Kong or Hong Kong under the British colonial rule. Tax will have to be collected. So they have the blanket provision. Anyone being caught will be liable because tax or levy collection is of top priority. And that's the mentality behind the stamp duty laws. So anyone signing the agreement will be held liable. But I don't think this is feasible. And I agree with Mr. Abraham Shack. It is not right to hold the agent liable. Well, when I spoke in the first round, I did not have the chance to explain this part. And at the Bills Committee, I already exchanged ideas with the government. I already explained my argument to them, and they also responded. That's how the Secretary responded. Under normal circumstances, the estate agent's signature on the agreement will not be deemed to have the effect of bringing liability on his part. What is meant by deeming? That is to say, it's subject to your discretion. So usually it will not be regarded as a party to the contract.
That's not very clear, and the agent doesn't have any legal protection. Of course, is it the case that the estate agents, trade associations have very strong demand on this? I wonder whether they know about this. And maybe some of them have to go through, to take certain courses. And maybe the lecturers will tell them that this is what is required under the law. But ultimately, this is something unfair. And the estate agents have not asked me to make this amendment. I spotted this myself, and I thought it is unfair. And estate agents may say that, Mr. Toh, if we are exempt from being liable, then it gets passed, and that's unfair to us. Well, nobody has ever said that in the past few months. I am a person who thinks through, and if I sign this document and I would be held liable, so then I will be able to ask for a higher commission because I am held liable. So I think that's a fancy argument. Since I am going to pay stamp duty for you, so please give me some extra commission. So I don't think that will happen. That will be said by the estate agent to the purchaser seller. So I think estate agents should be exempt, and I don't think the government should stick to its old thinking and in thinking that whoever execute the agreement, then they should be held liable. No, that should not be the thinking. The person is held liable, but he has done nothing wrong. He's just being the witness to the agreement. Why should he be held liable? The government said that we've never taken out any prosecution. It's not a matter of whether you have some precedent cases. Now, if we really do that, I'm sure that the ordinance would definitely be amended. If that really did happen, the estate agents would definitely take to the street to protest against this provision. But then the provision has been in the law for a long time, and the government has said that it has worked well, is time proven. I don't get that. You have not invoked that provision. You have been chasing only after the purchasers and sellers and not the estate agents. So you have never tried it. And that is, you have gone after the estate agent because you can't get the stamp duty payment from the seller or the purchaser. Maybe you said that you have recovered 5% or 10% from them. No, that's not the case. That has never happened. You haven't been able to, say, catch the agent because you couldn't get the payment from the seller or the purchaser. You have never done this. So how can you claim that the provision has worked well? So what do you mean by that? It's pointless. I mean, your remark is pointless. And also the government's reply is that if in clause 4.3, if anyone using the instrument should be held liable. Then I asked them in the course of the scrutiny, say if the estate agent has got 1% or 0.5% in the commission and the two sides don't pay him and I have to chase him and I have to present the document in the court to prove that they have done the deal, and I'm the one who helped with this. So I counted on this instrument agreement to take them to court to chase for the commission. Say if the estate agent wishes to recover agent commission from the buyer or seller by submitting a provisional agreement for sale and purchase as evidence, the agent may be liable for the payment of stamp duty. Well, that's outrageous. Now, if I have to use this agreement to recover the agent commission, well, I should be paid duly, right? If I have to present this in court and the instrument has to be stamped, if it is to be presented in the court, and you have to be liable for payment of stamp duty. So $10 million means $150,000 to be paid to the IRD. Now, if he uses this document to chase or recover this agent commission, then he still has to pay for the stamp duty. And as a result, he will not be taking the case to court, and his labor right is undermined. The buyers and sellers don't pay the stamp duty, and it's really the business of the government. Of course, it's not right for not to pay the government. The government will chase after the sellers and buyers. But then if the agent recovers the agent commission and then I use this instrument, then I have to pay the stamp duty first myself. So that will not happen. I won't pay the 15% stamp duty in order to recover my agent commission. So I'm just witness to the instrument, but I am being held liable, and I should pay the stamp duty. That doesn't make any sense. Chairman, I hope that members understand that these law comes with a long history, but then you are talking about 15%. So the scenario is different from that in the past when you had, say, 2%, 3% as the stamp duty. We're talking about millions of dollars here. And the estate agent has to sign on the instruments, and he works on such instruments every day. He hopes to get good business. So whenever you sign on an instrument, there's a possibility that you will have to pay $1 million or so. Is it proportionate to your income? No. I wonder whether insurance can be taken out for such a substantial amount of stamp duty to be paid, or is it the case the company will tell the agent that I will be taking the responsibility, just go ahead with trying to clinch deals? Well, the principle is wrong here, you may say, Mr. To. Well, let's not deal with this in this exercise. Allow me some time to think this through. Well, if you do that, then I will give you the chance to do that, and I will chase you afterwards. But then this time you told me that the system has worked well and it will continue, and this is so very unfair. In the course of scrutiny, because we're talking about 15%, which is a high tax rate. It used to be 10%, 1% or 2%, meaning a few $100. Then we're talking about 15%, and the estate agents are under great risk. And this is so very unfair. And, Chairman, I hope that the government, even for this exercise, well, maybe you say that what you said is right. Can you consider go back and review the situation? The Transport and Housing Bureau will talk to the IRD, and the IRD has a simple thinking. They think levying tax is most important, but you have to look at the fairness of things. Will it affect the stability of the income of the government? Will the government collapse because of this? No, that will not be the case. You should go after the buyers and sellers and not the estate agents. Maybe that was an extra level of safeguard when the ordinance was first drafted to ensure the IRD have a stable income. But then times have changed, and members have raised this new request because of new circumstances. I'm just asking you to consider this. It will not jeopardize your source of income. Well, but the government is not working like that. They are being insistent. They will not. They would just turn a blind eye to whatever we suggest. They can't budge an inch. Now, this is the kind of attitude they have. Now, there was in an interview I gave recently, and I was asked about the changes in the past 20 to 30 years. I cited this amendment bill as an example. I said that we can't reason things out with the government. They have a closed mind, I would say, and they would come up with all sorts of lame arguments to retort. And they said that the system has worked well, and they said that they have never chased after the estate agent. What kind of answer is that? I'm talking about legal arguments. I'm talking about principles. And you said that, well, believe me, we will not chase after the estate agents. This is not a reasonable discussion or exchange. Now, the new secretary, the new undersecretary, Mr. French and Mr. Dr. Raymond, so respectively, can you take a more pragmatic approach? Don't act like the CY Leung's government. Don't have a closed mind, so to speak. Mr. Abraham Shak. Thank you, Chairman. I would like to, respond Mr. Kenneth Leung's remarks. He said that he objected to Mr. James To's amendment, the third group of amendment. I don't get his reason for his objection. He said that for lawyers and auditors, they have this principle that whoever signs on the instrument should be held liable. Whether it's a lawyer signing an instrument or an auditor signing on audited reports for listed companies, well, they have a narrow responsibility. And as long as the sufficient information is provided, then they will vet on it, and that's their responsibility. For Mr. James To's amendments, I heard clearly why he was proposing the amendments. Say if auditors have taken on the role as an estate agent, I don't think the auditors will say what he said. Mr. To has made himself very clearly. He will get a commission as high as at maximum 5%. But we are talking about a stamp duty of 15%. That's way above the commission level. Now, he should be able to take on the responsibility given to him. Now, a young person may sit for the estate agent exam if he can't join any other trades and then serves as an estate agent. We should not put unreasonable responsibility or burden on the estate agent. So, Mr. To, I support your third group of amendments.
The Honourable James To, third group of amendments to amend Clause 10 of the Bill marked exempting estate duties from being liable for payment of the new AVD. I support this amendment for sense and for reason. The government should work for the people, as I said earlier in my earlier speeches, and in their best interest and for their interests. In case when there are competing interests discriminating against a particular group of citizens, a responsible government will always put everything into consideration before making its final decision. That they haven't done. Should the interests of certain groups of people need to be shortchanged, a responsible government will mitigate the harms against them as far as reasonable and practicable. This the government have not done either. This is the logic I adopt when considering James To's amendment. In the present case, James To's CSA, if adopted, would not upset the government's intention that only the buyer or the seller is the liable person for the AVD payment. His CSA would only make the ordinance more clearly by excluding estate agents under Clause 10, Bracket 4 and Clause 10, Bracket 6. I consider that such an amendment will complement the amendment bill's intention, as the administration has highlighted at the Bills Committee that an estate agent in general signing a provisional agreement for sale and purchase in the capacity of a witness will not be regarded as a liable person. It is that the administration does not, that the administration does not aim to make estate agent accountable for any stamp duty arrears, despite the fact that under the existing law, estate agent is one of the categories of persons liable to pay and from whom the collector may recover stamp duty. The administration says it has no intention to alter the first schedule. For so doing would fall out of scope of the bill. That's an excuse. Moreover, if the first schedule should be amended, would need the agreement of the Chief Executive to grant the exemption for moving such an amendment. See why I wasn't here then. Wasn't here now, but he was here then. But now we have a new executive. Ask her to do it. Well, James To tactfully chooses an alternative way to move his CSA without the need of amending the first schedule. Avoiding such procedural hurdle, the administration still considers that a charging effect within the meaning of Rule 57, Bracket 6 of the Rule of Procedure would be created if James To's CSA were passed, undermining the government's collection of its revenue. As far as the charging effect is concerned, Mr. President, the administration says there is a need to uphold the principle of revenue protection. That I can appreciate, Mr. President. I agree with your ruling that the so-called charging effect is unwarranted, since recovering stamp duty from estate agents is only one of the possible options, and the effect of James To's CSA is to remove this option, with estate agents excluded from all other persons executing under the existing provisions. It is difficult to see how and why losing the option would necessarily forego government's revenue as submitted by the government. To support its argument, the government revenue will be adversely affected if estate agent is exempted from being liable for the payment of the new AVD. The administration should at least provide some convincing evidence to show the estate agents have any idiosyncrasies and special forces capable of thwarting the government from collecting its revenue, or that such an exemption would have any bearing on affecting the government from so doing. For example, are estate agents prone to fraudulent behavior or scam? Why should they be discriminated against just because they are not professional like auditors or accountants or lawyers? It is unpalatable to hear that the administration resort to money argument again void of sound reasoning. Moreover, the administration argument seems to underestimate the ability of the Inland Revenue Department. Quite the contrary, like James told, I have confidence in the IRD's ability to collect tax and stamp duties. The working point is that the steadfastness of the IRD may place the interests of the estate agents in jeopardy, as estate agents will be caught by the existing law as liable person in scenarios illustrated earlier by James Toll. Mr. President, it is increasingly confusing about the main objective of this amendment bill. According to the administration, its demand-side management measures primary objectives are to combat short-term speculative activities, curb external demand, reduce investment demand, thereby stabilizing the property market, ensuring the healthy, stable development of the property market, and according priority to the home ownership needs of Hong Kong permanent residents in the midst of the present tight housing demand-supply balance. If my memory serves me right, protecting the government is not an objective. To speak less, an overriding objective of any of the demand-side management measures, but the government keeps on reiterating that protecting the government revenue or the possibility of incurring additional public expenditure being one of the very reasons for rejecting members' CSA. Why is protecting government revenue so important a reason for preventing the administration from accepting any CSA to the amendment bill to make it less problematic? As the administration cares so much about its revenue, let's talk about money again. From 2010 to 2011 to 2016 to 2017, the total amount of stamp duties collected were $379.2 billion, with a yearly average of $54 billion over a 7-year period. As regards to land premium, from 2010 to 2017, the total amount of land premium was $570 billion, with a yearly average of $81 billion over the 7-year period. In 2016-17, land premium together with stamp duty constitute $189 billion, or 33% of the government's total revenue. The government is undoubtedly very rich, yet it still insists on placing protection of government revenue above the interests of the people, especially the little guys, the estate agent. This is greedy. Greedy is not a financial issue. It is a heart issue. Do have a heart for them. And don't be so greedy about and force onto them on this particular liability. In contrast, although the number of estate agents has reached a new high of 37,000 as of June 2017, and they are not my voters, many of the estate agents living primarily on commission income are making ends meet, earning a monthly salary of $20,000 or less, with a basic salary of just a few $1,000s. There are but few success stories, as competition of the industry is fierce and work pressure of the petitioners is high, for their income fluctuated from time to time. How often you see estate agents fighting in the street just to lay hand onto a customer. Clearly, the majority of the estate agents are susceptible and disadvantaged. This is especially true when the AVD rates have been increased to the present high level. They can hardly afford the 15% AVD payment in case they are caught by the law inadvertently as liable persons when either the buyers or the sellers do not pay the AVD payment. As illustrated earlier by James Toh, under the current law, there is a possibility that an estate agent who signs a provisional agreement for sale and purchase needs to recover the agent commission 1%, 2%, whatever it is, from the buyer or the seller by submitting the signed provisional agreement as evidence. Then the estate agent is liable for a payment of AVD at the flat rate of 15%. This is unreasonable when the buyer or seller do not pay the stamp duty at the new flat rates. In this scenario, the agent will face a dilemma for either giving up his or her agent commission or pay the AVD payment they should not pay. Why does the government place estate agents in such a predicament? Why estate agents must be shortchanged to meet the government's unreasonable policy intention? This is by no means fair, just, or liberal. They should not shoulder the inappropriate responsibility and possible harms created by the government and its half-baked measures. This is against the new CE vision of people-based governance, thinking what people think, addressing people's pressing needs. Therefore, I do not see the reason why James Toh CSA cannot be accepted by the administration. Mr. President, we have talked to the government over the past 7 years since the first harsh measure of SSD introduced in November 2010. But we couldn't make the officials see sense. I can't figure out if that's our fault for failing to articulate our views without ambiguities, or we use a different language. And so the officials don't know, or don't want to know, and don't need to know what we have been saying. Thank you.
Mr. Diju. Thank you, Chairman. We're a few months away since the second reading of the bill, and the Chairman, you said that you've been rather liberal when it comes to the committee stage. In particular, since I'm speaking for the first time on the bill in the committee stage, I hope you can also be as lenient. For members of the public following this debate, I hope you can reconsider or recap the original intent of the government in launching such harsh measures. They are meant for demand-side management. They want to increase the cost of property acquisition so as to curb the increase in property prices. As said by many members, this objective has never been achieved. In a recent interview with RTHK, the CE Malaise went back on this undertaking given by Siwalam many years ago, and that is the government would do its utmost to ensure that property prices would be more reasonable so that we can all live happily in our own homes. In fact, Carrie Lam was tantamount to saying that there was nothing the government could do, and they could only do what they could do, and the outcome was beyond the control of the administration. This answer by Carrie Lam is very relevant to our debate today, and that is whether we should adopt the CSAs by two members here. Because the public can see for sure that we cannot really ensure Now, we can't, by means of these harsh measures, do what the public want most. The public really, what they want most is to have dignified accommodation. I don't think these harsh measures are answers to this aspiration, because there is a trend which we cannot evade. According to the Institute of Surveyors, in their report, the rise in property prices is due to a number of factors, and to a large extent is because of money and the flooding of renminbi into Hong Kong, low interest rate environment, and over liquidity all over the world. And we are all under this big environment. And another question is also high concentration of wealth among certain group of people. The FS in his blog recently said that when it comes to salaries and profits taxes, the figures are quite staggering. When it comes to salary tax, for the first 2.4%, 24,000 taxpayers are paying 46.9% of the salary tax collected by the government, given that there is no shortage of hot money, and with high concentration of wealth all over the world, we have faced up to the fact that these harsh measures are no solution to our housing problem. Now, returning to our bill in question, we have some amendments from Mr. James To and some from Mr. Holden Chow. Can they address the issues I just mentioned? Can they reverse the tide? I don't think that is possible.
但係佢冇，係咪又等於我哋唔應該支持佢呢？我覺得又唔係嘅，因為始終咧你涉及一個政府嘅公權力去加。
So even if there is no such effect, does it mean we shouldn't support the measures? No, because there is a domino effect or a linked effect of different measures. So while the overall environment remains the same, could some of these measures still address some of the issues? For example, many members mentioned 2 points. First one, over the past periods, the first-hand residential property market has an advantage, and for secondary market, it seems to have frozen. So the secondary market owners are simply unable to compete with the major estate developers because they have various means to attract buyers. So shall we therefore allow more flexibility in the secondary market? Well, I don't see why not, because if we have such measures, maybe some secondary market owners can sell their units, or some people are able to buy units in the secondary market. So we could at least help some people with their housing needs. Another point is similar to what Mr. James To said. Now, if estate agents have to then get involved, then they will have to shoulder the risk. If that's the case, is it possible that the estate agents may have to shoulder the risks if something should happen? So if there are some amendments that could relieve the estate agents of this risk, I think that would also address part of the problems. Now, Mr. James To mentioned a point I don't quite agree. He said that if we extend the exemption period, then we could revitalize the secondary market. So that means if a market is sold in the secondary market, that means there's supply of an additional unit, and in a year maybe we're talking about several thousands of units. It's better than for the government to go all over and hunt for land and build new units. Well, I'm afraid I do not agree to this viewpoint, because as I said at the beginning of my speech, now, the government says that this year the supply is 24,000. So does it mean that we have another 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 more units? Or if we have harsher measures, then we can resolve the problems? I don't think so. Maybe it's as Mr. James Ho has suggested, it would increase supply, but that doesn't address the core of the issue. Every year, the government resources various means to find land supply, and more than 50% of the land is then sold off to developers, and then the developers will go on to build units. Now, I think Dr. Ting-kwong gave a vivid description. You know, in Ting-kwong, for a 400-foot unit, it costs some $7 million, and that's considered a first-time buyer's home. And, you know, the government works so hard to find the land, and then units are built. But more than half of these units built cost hundreds of millions of dollars. These really aren't units for Hong Kong people because they can't afford to buy them. So the dual harsh measures have been proven a failure. Still, I would support the amendments. So it brings us back to the real issue. I hope the SL government won't sign a sign of relief just because these amendments will be passed. No. Carrie Lam cannot shirk her responsibility just by a sentence. Now we have a linked exchange rate, so we are stuck. We cannot change this fundamental monetary structure. But the government has a strong weapon. It is the biggest landowner in Hong Kong. And everyone will watch closely how the government makes use of its land resources. Now, as Dr. Ting-kwong suggested, if half of the land is then sold on to developers who then build units totally unaffordable to the people of Hong Kong, that means for 80 or 90% of the young buyers, they will have to flock to the units built in the remaining 40% of land sites. And that may be public housing, subsidized sales flats, and so on. If that's the case, the government's still not doing justice to the people. The government can't say that it has no control over capital flow, so it cannot help the public to have decent housing. No, the government could help because it has land. Or even rent control is a possibility. And what about charging for vacant units and so on, taxing for vacant units and so on? Well, you may say that people will have a way to work around that for, you know, taxing vacant units or whatever, but at least with rent control it could still help many ordinary tenants in residential units or in commercial units, because rent control is about giving the right back to the tenants. It's like the case for workers to have the bargaining power with their employers. Now, for tenants, if there's rent control, then in terms of the rent increase or the right to tenure, the tenants will be able to have some bargaining power. So land supply is one, the other is rent control. These are the two key issues. And after we consider the harsh measures, the government must not shirk away from these two issues. Don't corner the young people. The government has to answer the core issue. Well, we're not talking about buying properties. I'm not saying that we have to put our life savings or dedicate our life to buying a home. All we want is decent housing so we can live with dignity. We don't have to live in a property where we hit our head on the roof when we get up